Test one. Oh, look at there. We're hot. Are we recording this morning, Steve? Okay. Never know. Well, good morning. We are about to kick off. We're a couple minutes behind schedule, so if you're joining us online, that doesn't affect you because I know this is later for you, and we apologize for that. We hope to get back to live streaming at some point, but right now, everybody kept telling us that the hiccups in the feed and the rebooting and all that, it was too much of a distraction. So we are going to just record it and upload it later, and I apologize for that. Hopefully, we can get back to the live feed at some point. We are in the Gospel of Matthew, as we have been for a long time. We have been walking through, we are in the final, what's commonly referred to as the Passion Week, the final week of Jesus' life. He has gone into Jerusalem. He has came in on the foal of the donkey and caused a big stir, as that is viewed as a kingly proclamation. He went to the temple and caused a big stir there, and then he has been in the temple fielding questions and attacks from various religious groups. And last week we started in chapter 23, where he has now, I guess you could say, gone on the offensive. Instead of taking the questions, he has now started pronouncing woes. And we talked about, thank you. He started pronouncing woes, and we talked about that the woe is a proclamation of grief. It's not as much an accusation as it is an expression, a prophetic expression. We looked at Isaiah and how Isaiah pronounces woes, and this is we've talked about as Jesus comes in, he is assuming the role of a Hebrew prophet, and so he very much is continuing that line. We'll pick it up in verse 15 because that's where we left off last time. This is the second of the woes. The first one, they shut the door and don't let anybody, can't enter themselves and don't let anybody else in. And then we're in Matthew 23, starting at verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. So, tell us what you really think, Jesus. Don't hold back. That's pretty direct. That's pretty in your face. Call somebody a son of hell. That's pretty. Jason asked, "What's a proselyte?" Which is a good question. It's not a word we use a lot. A proselyte is really a convert. That's an easy way of it's an oversimplification. But people would could convert to Judaism. It's much more complicated than that, but that's a simple explanation that they're becoming a convert. They're becoming an adherent to the Jewish faith. And he condemns them for it's tied to their hypocrisy. That it's not that there's anything wrong with making proselytes. It's not that there's anything wrong with converting people. It is that they convert them and then they proceed to make them as big a hypocrite as the Pharisees themselves are. And so I told you, as we're going to look at these, we're looking at all of these with a light on ourselves, because we don't like to do that. We like to paint the Pharisees as the bad guys. But the bad guys, they're not really bad guys. They're the religious people. They're the religious leaders of the day. And so I think we do ourselves a disservice when I don't put myself in that position and say, how do I fit that bill? How do I stack up as a Pharisee? And so I think we have to ask. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Terry.
Well, we just about have to do that.
We have to do that.
Because
Absolutely. As Terry said, I'll restate that for the folks at home, but with our exposure to the text as well as in classes and our own education, we are inviting a stricter judgment on ourselves. We are much more like the Pharisees than we are like the people of the day. That they had the scriptures read to them. They did not carry them around in their pocket or on their phone or in their even own a Bible for the most part. Most would have been illiterate and wouldn't have been able to read the text. And so they were getting most of their religious instruction from people like the Pharisees. And so we are much more like the Pharisees than we are like the common people, if that makes sense. So how are we like this one, this specific woe? I'll give you an example that popped into my mind, and then we can run from there, give you a chance to think. I used to lead mission trips to Guyana, South America. That was one of our I don't know, we ended up there through a lot of different reasons, but and there were two groups that came into Georgetown, which was the capital. There was our group, there was a different group, and the other group did a lot of teaching, and the story that sticks out in my mind, we would go out into the little villages outside of town and connect with the churches that were established there for whatever reason. And we went out to one little church one time, and they're meeting in what used to be a schoolhouse. So it's just a little ramshackle shack. I mean, one room building. We would call it a shed. Really, it's just a square building. There's no rooms. There's no nothing. But these people would meet there to worship. Sweetest people you ever meet. I mean, love Jesus, they're just wonderful folks. And so afterwards, of course, they provide a meal, and we were sitting down with them, and one of the elders asked, "I have a question for you, Jeff." And they speak English there, and yes, sir. What can I? Yes, sir. What? And he says, "I want to know what your feelings are on kitchens in church buildings." And this exact passage is what popped up into my mind. Because number one, they barely had a church building. Number two, they didn't even have running water in it to have a restroom, let alone a kitchen. And he is worried about things that don't have anything to do with him. That's stuff that American Christians have brought over and put on him that doesn't have anything to do with his salvation or with anything having to do with him. And there's no reason for him to be worrying about kitchens in a church building. It has nothing to do with him whatsoever, has nothing to do with his salvation. But it was at the time one of the hot button issues that was being debated in churches of Christ. And so that was a delineating factor, one of the ways that they drew lines between those who were in and those who were out. And it's silly. And it's what Jesus is talking about here. You go all over the world trying to find people to convert, and then when you convert them, you make them just as big a hypocrite as you are. And so I think, again, if we're turning the flashlight on us, how do we do that? Or do we do that? Jason had his hand up, and then Cody.
I just wanted to apologize. I laughed because I thought you said
You don't ever have to apologize for laughing at me, Jason. You're in good company. There's lots of people laughing at me, and not usually on purpose. It's okay, Cody.
we do that among different religions to this day. We don't focus on just Christianity. You go to a Baptist church, they're going to teach. There are certain things that they want you to know. And like you say, we focus more on the law versus
Ooh, there you go.
Romans teaches that a lot. If we hang on to the law, we're never going to succeed. If you hang on to Jesus, then the law is going to surround you. You're going to know. You're not going to want to argue.
Amen. Amen. What for those at home, Cody said was, Christians do the same thing today. We go between denominations, and you'll go to another church, and Baptist church is going to teach you a certain doctrine, and this kind of church is going to this kind. And when reality, if we would just focus on Jesus, we could find a lot more common ground than division. totally agree with you. I think you'll hear me say this a lot. One of Satan's greatest victories has been splintering the body of Christ into all kind of different warring factions because we're so busy fighting with each other, we're not focused on what the real enemy is. Sorry, doesn't take much to get me preaching. Anybody else that you can think of? How do we pass on our hypocrisy? That's a very East Texas way of saying our hypocrisy. How do we pass on our hypocrisy, Steve? By judging others when we're taught not to judge. Absolutely, and we judge on all kind of merits, and you know, it's just who we. Some of it is just human nature. We look at people and we make decisions about who they are based on what they look like, how they talk, how they act. I mean, you know, we can go on and on and on, but absolutely. I was looking to see if I thought I missed somebody. I miss anybody? How do we pass on our hypocrisy like the Pharisees? Nobody's gonna go any further. Well, let's go on to the next one because he's not through. He's just getting warmed up here. Verse 16. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that's nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And you say, whoever swears by the altar, that's nothing, but whoever swears by the offering that's on it is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, the one who swears by the altar swears both by the altar and by everything on it. The one who swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells in it. And the one who swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Wow. Okay, so there's a lot going on here that we don't get because we don't swear by the temple. It's not really something that is part of our vernacular. If swearing was not like we think of swearing was making an oath, making a promise, and what they would do would pull in something holy to sanctify that promise. And so I promise that I'm going to do such and such for Cody, and I say that, I secure that by saying, I swear by the offering on the altar of the temple that I'm going to do this. And they made all these little nitpicky rules that I can't just swear by the altar, because if I swear by the altar, that doesn't mean anything. But if I swear by the offering that's sitting on the altar, then that means something. Well, and Jesus is like, you blind guy. I mean, it's just, and if I don't swear by the temple, I swear by the gold in the temple because that's more valuable, and so therefore my oath means more because somehow it's connected to something more. Now we read this one and we go, hey, we're pretty good on this because, you know, I don't swear by the gold of the temple. I don't swear by the offering on the altar. But I think one of the core things that we're getting to here that we do struggle with is when the physical building becomes more important than the worship that's conducted inside of it. Yeah. So there are people who will leave here today and will go outside and get in their car and crank up the Johnny Cash gospel album and drive away to go to lunch. If we played that exact song inside this room, they would tell you that I was going to hell. So the temple is more important than, I know I'm gone to meddling, but I'm just giving you an example. We do a lot of things like this. And we have this temple mentality that we don't like to talk about, but these holy bricks are much more valuable than what's happening out there. And we say we don't believe that because I remember being taught as a child, you know, that the church is not the building, the church is the people, right? And I was always taught that. Now that wasn't the practice because we didn't go to the people. We went to the place. and we would, you know, go to church, and we would put on our church clothes, and we would, yeah, you got what I'm talking about. And so there were some hands over here, Cody, and then Terry. Absolutely. He calls them blind what, 3, 4 times right there? Blind guides. You know, you're trying to guide people along, and you don't know where you're going. When I used to tell a story when Allie was little, she was about 2, 3, maybe 3, because she was big enough. She was running around, maybe 3 or 4. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm doing what my dad always did. We go in the grocery store, and me and Hillary had to line up behind her because she was in charge and she was the leader. Now, she didn't know what we were there for. She didn't know where the things were on the aisle. She did, yeah, you know, you got a 4-year-old. She don't know what's going on, but she was the leader. And Dad, you need to get in line because I'm the leader. And I used to laugh and say, that is a lot of churches right there. Because there's somebody going, follow me, I'm the leader. Where are you going? I have no idea. But, Terry?
Well, we used to do this on the world. You can trust me because I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
We get to thinking that the commandment about using the Father's name in vain is about swearing,
Yeah.
but it's about how I represent Him.
Oh, man. Whew. There you go. And that's a whole bigger ball of wax, but absolutely, it's still that hypocrisy. I'm still saying it like that. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jerry. Jerry said, it's been said we live by the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. And that's true. How else do we value the building more than the worship that goes on in the building or the body that meets in the building? Anybody want to comment on that? I know I'm messing. Oh, Preston's. I couldn't tell if your hand was up or if you were just kind of stretching or. Okay. Even the process, I restate for the folks at home. Y'all hadn't been in here, so. But Briston said even the process of how we approach Sunday, that day is so separated from all the other days. And we do. We view it as a Christian Sabbath. I mean, honestly, when I was little, we weren't supposed to do certain things, and we couldn't do this and that because it's the Sabbath and you need to rest. And you know, when you're a kid, you don't want to rest. There was another hand. I saw another hand. Cody.
They come here to seek personal gain, you know, whether it's
Ooh.
days or come to gain something that will help them personally rather than come to seek and praise Jesus for His sacrifice.
Come to seek personal gain instead of legitimately seeking Jesus. And there's people that do that with Jesus, right? I mean, He's feeding people because they come to get fed, and He calls them out on that. But I don't think that in itself, using something to draw people in, He does that a lot. But I agree. If you're claiming to be a disciple, these are people that are on the outside that He's doing that with. If you're claiming to be a disciple and that's still your relationship, it's a very superficial relationship. It's like, you know, I don't know. I'm about to rabbit trail and I caught myself. Brakes are handy. Terry.
That's not altogether a bad thing.
No.
I know a couple of preachers in the church who came to Christ because they got the promise of being able to go out with a girl after.
Absolutely. It's not necessarily a bad thing. That's what I'm saying. Jesus used, some of that flash and some of that stuff to draw people in. That in itself is not bad. I think what we're talking about is if you've been a Christian for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, and that's still your relationship, You know, if you came to church because of a girl, there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of people who've done that, or vice versa. I'm not, but if that's how it started for you, that's good. But at some point, we're hoping you're developing a relationship with Jesus and that you're not still, a disciple of the girl. And that's the point. There's a lot. We could do this for a long time, and I don't want this to be a gripe session. That's not my point. But I do want us to realize these things apply to us. Let's move on to 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. So he calls out the scribes and the Pharisees for their tithing. Now, tithing in itself is not wrong. He doesn't condemn tithing. He condemns their manner of tithing, where they're so focused on the minuscule, on the tiny details, that they're missing the bigger picture. What I call majoring in the minors. They're so worried about the little things that they're missing the bigger things. They made a big deal out of their tithes, and one of the ways they did that was through their spices. And so, if they had mint leaves, they would count out their mint leaves so that every 10th one would be dedicated to God. It would be the part of their tithe. Now, we get how ludicrous that sounds. We're counting mint leaves. Now, that's because we go to the grocery store and buy mint leaves in sacks or whatever. It was a much more precious commodity. If you remember your history classes when you were in school, a lot of the exploration of the world was looking for trade routes to go get spices. Remember that? Spices were a big deal, much bigger deal than they are to us. We have spice racks. They didn't have that. And so it was a much bigger deal. However, it was still a minuscule thing that you're being so particular about how many mint leaves you have, but you're not worried about justice. You're not worried about mercy. You're not worried about faithfulness. Jesus doesn't say you should choose one or the other. He says you should focus on the one and not neglect the other. He says it's not a either or, it's a both and. Justice, mercy, and faithfulness is more important than counting your mint leaves. And if you talk to a Pharisee, you would have thought at that time that having the perfect tithe was very important to being holy, to being righteous, to being accepted by God. So my question today is, we don't count out our spice leaves, but what would people say, and I'm talking about people outside of the church, what would people say are the most important things for being righteous to us today? What are the most important things? Now, I'm not asking you. I'm asking, what would people outside here who have no relationship to the church or to Christians other than interacting with you in your daily life or interacting with other Christians or, whatever, what would they say Christian values are all about? What are the most important things to us? Having unity with one another. Okay, you think somebody outside the church would say that? That drives by and sees 500 churches in one town? I mean, I agree that should be our number one priority. That's something, it was so important. That was the last thing on Jesus' mind. It's the last major, before the garden, it's one of the last prayers that he prays. And so I agree with you that should, but I want to hear what you think people outside the church would say about us. Cody? Say that again? we are trying to help people in need. And I do agree with you that that is something that we are known for. And especially this church, very much so. We're going to go Jason, then Kara. Jesus freaks. Yep, that's a common thing. We're going to go Kara and then Neil. They don't drink, they don't cuss, they don't chew, and they don't run around with girls who do. Yep. Gay bashers, that's one of the big things that we're known for right now. Okay, Megan? Where and when and how much? That is our attendance is a very important thing to us. Cody? Woo! The name on the building, the name on the sign is very important. Is it Kim? I can't see. I got bright lights in my face. Yes, ma'am. Making sure people follow all the rules, which, thank you, is a great segue because it brings us right back to what Jesus is talking about, Philip. Goody goody two shoes. There you go. I like that. But that's true. That's the way we're looked at, from the outside. And that's what Jesus is talking about. You're so focused on all these little rules that you're missing the big picture. I'll give you a great example that happened to us, and I'm not going to tell you who was with me because we were standing in line I will tell you because, y'all don't know any of these people, but we were standing in line to check in at LTC. And so there's a bunch of people behind us, about 4 or 5 people behind us. There's a guy who is a preacher. I know this because he was telling everybody, and he was talking really, really loud. Not that that's a stereotype, but it is. And he's talking really, really loud, but he's talking to the other people around him that are from somewhere else. And this dude is telling everybody's business, like whose marriage is in trouble, whose kid's on drugs, who's sleeping with who. And loudly. And I lean over to Heather and I said, if he would say one cuss word, this whole place would turn and jump on him. But he can gossip for an hour and a half and nobody says a word. And I'm sorry, but it's sin, and it's happening right there in line at a Christian event, and nobody, including myself, says a word. And it's the exact same thing. If he would have even just said hell, the whole place would have erupted. But he can gossip about everybody and everything that he knows, and nobody says a word. And it's the same thing. We're straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. That's Jesus throws out the hyperbole, and if you don't think Jesus is funny, you got to read this again because that's a funny picture. That they would strain out the gnats because they didn't want to accidentally or whatever swallow. That's a whole big theological thing that they did. But he's making the point. You're gonna pour your beverage of choice, and we'll quibble some other time over whether it was wine or water, but they'll pour their beverage through a strainer so that they don't drink a gnat and become unclean. And he's like, but you'll strain out a gnat, but you're swallowing a camel. And yes, it's a ludicrous picture, but that's the point he's making. You're so focused on these little minuscule things that you're missing the bigger picture of what you're supposed to be about. Harkens back to what he was just talking about: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Those are the big picture items, and you're worried about counting mint leaves. So I think we do the same thing. We focus in on the minor offenses, and we get so focused in on the minor offenses that we forget about some of the bigger offenses, some of the bigger things that we should be worried about. And Jesus doesn't say choose one or the other. He says you should have focused on the one without neglecting the other. He says don't not that you're supposed to stop tithing, you're supposed to do both. And so anyway, sorry, enough of that. Verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish so that the outside of it may become clean as well. We're going to add the next one because it ties on to this as well. 27. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to people, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. So now he's talking about we want to look good. It's better to look good than to be good. And it's better to have this appearance of righteousness than it is to actually be righteous. And I'm not gonna ask for specifics in this because we're going to get a little bit too personal, and I don't want to. It's too much for a Sunday morning. But it's true. One of the things you'll hear from people outside of churches, they don't come in because they feel judged, because I'm not righteous enough, I'm not holy enough, I'm not good enough, and all those people look down on me. And we, Huntsville Church of Christ, strive very hard. We don't hit the mark, and I'm not naive enough to think that we're perfect, but we try really hard to not be that, because I personally don't want people to say, well, I can't come in because I'm not righteous enough, I'm not holy enough, I'm not good enough, because the truth of the gospel is none of us are. There's none of us that are righteous. That's what Paul says. That's not Jeff. That's the Bible, and there's none of us that are good. We're just saved, and that's the only difference. Dick had his hand up, and then Katie. We need to make sure that there's no barrier, that there's no fence. Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. 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 Katie, you had your hand up. I'm happy with that. I'm okay with that. Um, John, say it again. You notice I didn't. Nathan picked right up on that. He didn't repeat that one for the people at home. That's all right. I'll say it. Katie said, whenever I'm inviting people to church, I make sure and let them know at least once a year our preacher tells a story about the time he went to jail. So you'll have to be here because you never know when that's going to be. So, John. Absolutely. He started out talking about their phylacteries and their tassels and wanting the seats of honor. And they're not doing that to impress the common people. They're doing that to impress the religious people because they want to be seen as hyper religious. And so we can just as much be a hypocrite for one another as we are for those on the outside. Is that fair along with what you're saying? Because, well, and okay, let me get Miss Grace. Absolutely. A lot of times that is just an excuse. That it's an excuse that we don't come to church because of this or that, when in reality it is it's just a reason. It's just something to make me feel better about what I'm doing. Jason.
What, what about, or what would you say to someone who says if they came to church, it wouldn't be genuine?
Okay, I explain.
I'm talking about my son.
Uh huh.
I've asked him several times, like when he's in town, hey, you want to go to church with me? And he tells me, yeah, if I went to church with you, it wouldn't be genuine.
Okay. Okay. I get what he's saying. I understand that. But I think sometimes I do a lot of things for people in my life that I don't want to do. I mean, that would be my response. I will take my kids somewhere this summer that I really don't want to go. Whether that's Disney World or I mean, whatever. I mean, they're too old for that, but you know what I mean. We go places we don't really want to go, and we do that because we love people, and so I think there's something to be said that sometimes maybe coming with you is just because he wants to do what you would like for him to do. Um, and that's just that. No, I get what he's saying. You're coming to church. If you're just coming to church coming to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than going to McDonald's makes you a Big Mac. I get that. But sometimes you do things for other people. There was Terry and then Cody.
Well, again, this congregation has really strove to create opportunities to join in fellowship through share group meetings or remote off facility Bible studies, that kind of thing, to reach out to those who have that kind of excuse.
Right. Absolutely.
And that is admirable.
And yeah, that's why we do a lot of those different things, a lot of those different activities, whether it's share groups or whether it's the big ticket. You've heard me talk about, I call them open door activities, things that we do like the Fall Fest that is easy to invite people to. That's the purpose of that, because maybe somebody wouldn't come to church, but maybe they'll come to one of those and then they realize, well, those people aren't what I thought they were. Maybe those people are better. Cody had one, and then we'll go to Nathan.
One thing I see here is Jesus saying, woe to you. I see a singular image put out here. If we're coming outside of our door acting like we're all holy, but then again, we're having an affair with Miss Betsy down the street and never seen, what is our image looking at behind the closed door?
Absolutely.
Come out the house, we want to have this perfect holy image, but deep down inside our heart, it's not holy. We can't go make love to the new go see Miss Betsy down the street or whatever.
Right. Right. Whatever it is, it's more. We're going to circle back to that. Let me get Nathan. Absolutely. Absolutely, you're right. Yeah, that when people say, I'm repeating for the folks at home, that when people say, the church is full of hypocrites, one of the best ways to deal with that is to acknowledge it and say, yeah, you're right, because we are. We're all struggling. We're not. And if you, I was going to circle back to Cody's because I think you're right. What Jesus is not condemning failing. He's not condemning us trying to hit the mark and not being able to do it. He's condemning us when we pretend that we're perfect and we want to put that out to other people that you need to be more like me. That's what the Pharisees did. Hypocrisy is, we talked about this before, the word hypocrite means actor. It means somebody wearing a mask. It means somebody playing a role. And so it's not somebody who's trying to follow Jesus and failing. It's somebody who's pretending. They have a mask on. They have some kind of, they're playing a role. They're an actor. And that doesn't have anything to do with how you dress. I know a lot of churches where the preacher will get up and look like he just rolled out of bed because they think that's and they wear that as a badge of honor. Look how much more spiritual I am than you because you have to dress up on Sunday morning and I can wear holy jeans. And I mean, it sounds silly, but there is that. Well, I'm better than you because I don't adhere to those traditional rules. It's still hypocrisy. It's just a different hypocrisy. Because we're still basing my righteousness on what I look like or how I dress or look at how much holier I am than you. It's not a conservative or liberal thing because there's just as, we talked about being tolerant and accepting people, but there's just as much on the other side, people that accept so much that they sacrifice the Word of God in the same thing at the altar of tolerance. And so hypocrisy is not just a one-dimensional thing that only applies to certain churches. We all run the risk of walking in that path. I know we're almost out of time. I really wanted to get through this today because the whitewashed tombs during Passover, they would paint all the tombs white. They would paint over them with a white paint. And the reason for that was so that somebody wouldn't accidentally touch one and become unclean when they were coming to make their offering. So somebody who's from out of town who doesn't know that that's a tomb, they weren't allowed to touch those things because if they did, they'd be unclean. And then there was a long time that they had to go through these big purification rituals and all that. And so they would paint over them so that people would know not to touch this and become unclean. He's saying you're the same way because you look pretty on the outside, but on the inside you're full of dead men's bones. You're just a whitewashed tomb. We don't have time. We'll pick up with verse 29 in the last one next week because there's no way we're going to get into all that. Hey, thank you for your conversation today. Everybody's participation made this a lot better. I didn't talk as much, and that's always better. And so I appreciate you doing that. We'll pick up in verse 29 of chapter 23 next week. You got 15 minutes. Go take care of your business, love your neighbor, hug somebody's neck, shake a hand, come back in here ready to worship at 10 o'clock.